to things. And this idea is measured by an assessment called the locus of control. And locus means location is either internal to me or it's external. And again, obviously control, what can you control? And it's really how we view our ability to control the external environment, and also how we control our internal environment as well. But quite often as organizations, we're looking at things that are happening in the external environment, and are we able to control or affect those things? And at times when crisis happens, some leaders may go into the over-controlling mode, or maybe like even hyper-controlling, or some can slide too far into the I don't know what to do, or I'm powerless to it, and maybe feels like a victim. And we want to maybe find ourselves somewhere in between there. So ideally, we want to spend time thinking about what it is that we can control and what we can't control. And so what we do know is there's some techniques I can share with you maybe near the end about ways that I've been trying to approach it with myself and with my friends and family and clients. But we know that there are certain times where leaders can really move into that hyper control mode. And that actually has sometimes makes them feel okay for a while, but it has its downside, is that if we get to a place where we're trying to kind of squeeze it too hard, because what can happen is the leader can feel eventually by when they slide into hyper control mode, they become very frustrated, and then they also, that shows up sometimes as anger with their teammates or their families and people around them, and it could just cause the situation to worsen. And when we look at what do our teams look for right now, during times of chaos and in crisis, I think quite often our teams look for us to provide some stability, and to provide some type of calmness to an extent. So what we need leaders to do during these time frames is to really be very good at knowing how to self-regulate. And that's a piece I think is important. Learning how we do that ourselves is a critical place, because it's like from situational leadership, the idea is that if things are too calm, sometimes we want to shake that up and change things. If things are too chaotic, that's the last thing we want to do, is make it more chaotic. So right now, I believe that we're probably all going through that time frame where we're trying to make some sense of things and calm things down a bit. That makes sense. Are there any initial questions or thoughts there at this point? I'm not hearing what, so I'll come back. Certainly, Savy, if you got any questions at the end, I'd be happy to take them at the end too. Yeah. I see there's a couple of questions popping up in the chat, but I'm gonna introduce something else here as we get into just a bit about the brain science and what we know about what's emerging from neuroscience. And neuroscience, for those who know or don't know, is when they strap up human beings to electrodes and they run stimuli by them, and they measure what's going on in the brain with blood flow and oxygen flow. And they're seeing that obviously the human brain is very complex, and I'm not going to be able to capture the whole part of it, but there's certain things, certain patterns that show up. And there's two primary systems to I think to help me. It made sense to me first off. There's an older part of our brain that's been around for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. It's referred to as the limbic system. And the limbic system is made up of the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the hippocampus. And that is our alarm bell type of part of our brain. It's what's protecting us from external threats. And so it's almost like our unconscious. We don't have to think about it very much. It just tends to activate really quickly when there's any type of threat. And then it also releases neurochemicals, or helps our bodies prepare to release neurochemicals. But there's also the prefrontal cortex, which is two major systems that are constantly in tension with each other. And that's the one that's right behind our forehead. It's a relatively new part of our brain, 65,000, 70,000 years old possibly. And that's our conscious mind. It generates our ability to think about the future, to be engaged, to be motivated. All tends to their risk and reward. It's all there. It's what we understand and perceive as our consciousness. And those two systems are in play almost all the time. The frontal cortex does wear out fast. It's not as powerful as the limbic system. So, but the limbic system is the really interesting part here, in that what it can do to us. It can take over the prefrontal cortex. It actually is the part that stimulates a lot of neurochemicals, and there's two in particular that I think we should consider right now. One is cortisol. Cortisol is released in the adrenal glands, and then it feeds back into our limbic system, and it's that feeling of anxiety and anxiousness, and maybe a little bit of fear. It's our bodies preparing us to run and get away from some type of threat. Cortisol, if anybody's experienced this lately, whether you've woken up out of a sound sleep in the middle of the night, that was probably cortisol that woke you up. It's a really powerful steroid, and it's not necessarily good for us at all. It does prepare us to run, and so does adrenaline, a few other things. But that over a period of time, when we don't need to be running, it can be a very damaging kind of situation. And then there's the other neurochemical is oxytocin, and oxytocin is a feel-good neurochemical. And what basically our brain is doing in a very basic sense, it's doing one of two things. It is either taking us towards something, we're approaching something, and because it's a reward or it feels good, and that's driven by oxytocin, or it moves us away from something, and that's cortisol, because that's a threat. So we move toward rewards, we move away from threats. And obviously, back in the days when we were living on the plains in the savannah, if a tiger came over the hill, our bodies and brains told us to run, and that's how the brain was formed. So any type of threat now, still today, can have the same kind of effect on us as far as releasing a cortisol. And cortisol, I say it again, cortisol is a nasty neurochemical, because again, it's going to wake us up. If it gets released into our system, I mean, the research shows that it stays in your system for about 48 hours, and it takes a long time to work its way through. And so when the limbic system is activated because of an external threat, what happens is our prefrontal cortex cannot function as well as it did when it's not under threat. And so if you've ever been frightened by something, that feeling is that you really don't have the ability to think your way through something, because it's being overwhelmed by the limbic system's anxiety. So any feeling of anxiety, fear, those kind of stressors are usually because our limbic system is hyperactivated. And I think right now we're probably dealing with a lot of hyperactivity in our limbic system, because crisis sometimes feels like threat, and it makes us get a little bit on edge. So there's a model that got put together a few years ago by a gentleman named David Rock. And David Rock said that there is these 5 different letters that he formed into an acronym that we can look at as far as leadership and management goes. And we can compare some of these things to seeing what creates engagement, or moves people towards something, or what creates situations that moves people away from us, for managers and for organizations. And it's called the SCARF model. And I want to talk a little bit about that while we're together. But it stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. That's the SCARF model. For those of you in my roundtables, you know that we've come back to this quite a bit. There are just certain things that we now know that disengage people from a psychological, emotional state. And so for right now, we're dealing a lot with this idea of uncertainty, the C of certainty. And what I'll say about that is that our brains really crave certainty. We prefer things to be stable. We prefer things to be predictable. And so whenever that's not happening in the external environment, what happens is it registers as an error in our brains, and our brains try to correct that error. It wants to go back to stability. It wants to go back to what it knew was normal. All right. And so during that time frame, when it's trying to do that, that's when it comes off as a threat, and that's when cortisol is released. So all of us trying to make sense of uncertainty right now creates a threat response in our brains, and then the following neurochemicals get released, and then we feel that anxiety and fear. All right. And so we're all kind of dealing with certain levels of that. Our teams are dealing with that as well. All right. So this idea of uncertainty is something that we're struggling with. And so we know that the future is pretty much uncertain, but we try to make sense of it, make things certain. So if we're if we find ourselves doing that and trying to control things, trying to make things certain, that's actually could make us feel uneasy right now. So, and when that happens, obviously for us individually, we release that cortisol steroid, and that's not a good thing for us. So there's things I believe that a leader can do, and right now to take care of herself and himself. Obviously it always starts with leadership. It almost always starts with what are you doing, for yourself to be able to self-regulate and to be the best you can while you're going through these things. But remember, I believe that our teams want us to be very self-regulated and to know what we can and cannot control, and then helping them as well. So we can work on some things that ourselves, and hopefully you're doing these things. And I'm certainly not trying to give anybody any advice, but I think these things are shown to really have an effect of reducing cortisol in our bodies and our physiological selves here. So first one, to reduce cortisol, one of the most direct things that you can do is exercise. And whatever form of exercise you find that you feel comfortable with, this is a good time to be doing it. Personally, I've tried to amp up my time walking right now at this point, trying to get out and do a little bit more walking than I normally have before. I've also started doing back into a yoga practice and stretching and weightlifting. And all that's important, because it actually, there's evidence that says when you actually do exercise, it actually pushes the cortisol out of your system faster. So again, whatever you're comfortable with, certainly don't want you to go out there and get hurt, doing something you haven't done before. But I mean, whatever you have been doing, and as far as exercise, this is a good time not to forget that, and keep doing as much of it as you can. That will reduce that cortisol. Getting enough sleep. And so, I know that people are probably trying to work extra hours and working really hard, or they're under the stress, but trying to find, getting into a rhythm there. Sleep has a very positive effect on our brain's ability to recover. And so certainly think it's important. And the next one is this idea that I'm sure you've all heard of. It's referred to as mindfulness, or in meditation, or in some people view it from the standpoint of prayer, possibly. But there is evidence that says that meditation and mindfulness have the ability to reduce the cortisol in our system. So, and you don't need a lot of it. You can do as much as you want, but 5-10 minutes of anything that gets you out of that routine and get you into a state of mindfulness or flow. And it can come from doing something new. It can come from just walking your dog. It can come from just simply looking at your environment and where you are right now and thinking about where you are, but trying to get your mind not to keep running, faster. Sort of think about your thinking. Mindfulness has a strong correlation, to reducing cortisol. They've actually done studies and done blood samples of people who are avid lifelong meditators and see the cortisol levels are lower. The last one here that I think you can do is if you are a news junkie. I'm trying to ration my time looking at social media and looking at the news. I mean, because the first week, I'm probably like all of you, I was really just looking at too much of it. And so I've tried to cut that back now. I've tried to go back to, well, I'm doing a little bit in the morning and maybe a little bit in the afternoon. I'm trying to stop at a certain point, because the news media is really driven. I mean, it's important. I'm not bashing it, but it's important because it tends to show a lot of negative things, which can register as a threat response for us. And many of it we do need to know about. Obviously, I think it's important to know as much information as you can, but I think we have to also just kind of regulate that a little bit. And I try certainly not to watch it late in the evening, because that's what I'm going to take to bed with me. And it's like, yikes, I'm going to be awake all night. And so I try to ration it out in whatever way you can do that your own stuff. That may be good. Even there's some research out there that's the phrase they call is backward masking. And all it takes is for you to walk past a TV screen that's got some news broadcast on. Just seeing it in the corner of your eye can trigger the threat response. So it's very powerful. And so whatever we can do to kind of balance that out ourselves is important. The other technique I would think about doing, and I practice this one myself, is that I sat down in the first week and I wrote out a couple of pages of a list of things. I made 2 lists. One list I wrote on one thing was the things I could control. And I made a list of the things that I knew I could control. All right. And I made a list of things I knew I could not control. And what I did was on my list of things I could control, I said, I can control my exercise, I can control my diet, I can influence other people, and there's certain things that I do. I can do all these things. I made a list of what I knew I could focus on and actually have some control over. On the other list, I mean, as much as I would love to be the inventor of the vaccine, I can't do that. So I just said, that's on my list, but I can't do that, And do I want to stop a recession from happening? Well, no, yeah, but I can't do that. That's a macro environmental thing. So I looked at that list over there. I said, these are the things I cannot control. And the concept here is that you surrender that list. All right, it's the term surrender. And people sometimes think, well, it mean giving up. No, it doesn't mean giving up. It just means that I'm not going to be a victim to it. It just means that I'm just not going to spend any energy on that list. I'm just not going to put any mental energy to that because it doesn't do any good. It's not going to help anything. It's not going to help me or my community or the world. So that list over here that I said I can't control, I just remind myself what it was, and I surrendered to it. And some people I've heard of tearing it up, throwing the fireplace. Get rid of that is, yeah, whatever you got to do to get that list out, okay? It's focusing on what can I control. And I think that's what our teams want us to do, all right? So I'm going to go to the next one and the last piece, and then kind of give us some time to ask questions. And I've seen all kinds of good suggestions. So lots of walking and getting outdoors, all that stuff, good, and deep breathing, absolutely, that's all good. But let's take the SCARF model and talk about what it is that our teams might be needing right now, because you all have organizations that have employees and coworkers. You all have families as well. So what should a leader be doing for the team that they're leading? Well, let's look at the SCARF model. So status is the top one, okay? Status is profoundly important to human beings. We're constantly comparing ourselves to other people. It's a constant thing. And whenever we feel like we're of lower status, it actually threatens us and it triggers the limbic system. And we get cortisol release. So whenever that's happening, if we don't feel good. If we feel like we're of higher status than somebody else, it actually has the other effect of being more of a positive thing. So when we give somebody advice or we tell somebody what to do, it makes the limbic system activate the other person in the negative way. So right now is probably not the time for a leader to be going around and telling the team what to do and giving orders or giving advice. Probably not the time to be doing that. I'm sure if it ever is. But what I would be doing at this point, I think could be very beneficial for your team is that, being very active first as a leader, being active, being out there, being very visible. I would think about what is your normal asked to tell ratio. All right. And so, again, if it should be more like 90% asking right now. And what I would mean by that is I would think it's a good idea to be out there talking to my teams and asking them questions. If I ask people questions, I'm actually elevating their status above mine temporarily. I'm asking a question. I'm curious of what they want to know. And by doing that, it can go from the simple to the complex. Simple questions like, how are you doing? How's your family doing? To the more complex things like, well, what is it that you think the organization should be doing right now? Strategic questions, or what can we do for you? It's simply asking lots of questions has a wonderful benefit because it will actually make them feel closer to you and more engaged because they're going to feel slightly higher status than maybe they did before. And you get a chance to gather a lot of good data from their answers. Right now, I would be out there talking about and asking questions versus giving directions or giving commands. That's your orientation. Try to reverse it a little bit. So try to ask questions right now at this point. The C stands for certainty. And again, as I talked about earlier, how important that is. Now, for the leader now, the best I can tell you here is that even though we probably have in the back of our minds a little stress about certainty, we need to tell our teams exactly what we know. And we need to be very honest and open with them. We need to tell them what we know, tell them the facts, tell them what you know. Now, I'm not saying, you can certainly don't want to make stuff up. That doesn't help. But you also don't want to hide information necessarily. Whatever information you have, they probably need to know. All right. And so, and then staying real with that. I had a friend who told me back in the Great Recession of 2006, he said that, he went around his team and they were all talking about how bad the economy was and look at the GDP and look at unemployment's raising and look at the stock market. And it was all conversations about the economy. And he said, yeah, he knew that the company was down about 10%. So he said he called everybody together one afternoon and he said, okay, it's like a $15 million a year company. He said, how many of you guys out there have economics degrees? And he said, nobody in his team raised their hand. He goes, oh, that's what I thought. He goes, so here's what I want you to do going forward. Stop talking about the economy because you don't know what you're talking about, and neither do I. He said, so what I know is we're down 10%. If you all, and if I do the same thing, if we all make 10% more phone calls, I'm certain we're going to be fine. I want you to stop talking about the economy, make 10% more phone calls, and we're going to get through this. And he said, if that doesn't work, the next stage is we're going to take a 5% pay cut. Everybody will take it. That's the next phase. But right now, this is what I want you to do. He said, everybody went, okay. They went back to work, and there was no more talk in the offices about the economy. They went back to work. So it's that kind of thing. Tell them what you know. Tell them this is what we're going to do. Here's our short-term plan. And all that should come from some of your data you get from asking questions right now. All right. So again, very active about asking questions and making sure that they know what you know. Okay. So being visible is important. Autonomy is the A for SCARF model. And autonomy is something that we all like, and our employees like it. This is a time probably to be setting mutual goals with them and letting them achieve those, letting them organize their own lives and their own situations and getting things done the way they feel it's best to do. This is not a time to micromanage. It's not that time. That will actually cause the reverse. Okay, they'll be more disengaged, and that's not what we want to have happen. So we have got virtual employees out there that some of us are dealing with now, and we're now virtual. And yep, okay, so now we're going to have to work very hard. I think that's going to be one of the best lessons that we all can learn from this is how do we manage more autonomy into our companies. The employees that you really value, they will perform with more autonomy. I certainly think it's going to be more engaging. Just a couple more. Relatedness is the R. And relatedness is that feeling that we all get when we belong to a group and we're allowed to be in a group. And normally I would say what we want to do is to do social events together and to do team building things together. I mean, right now that's kind of hard to do. Right now we're all spread out, okay? And so we're going to need to think about how do we keep our team's identity, all right? The team's identity, and that's important. And so whatever ways we can think of to keep our teams connected with their identity in a virtual setting would be a good idea. This is almost like branding your company to your most important stakeholder, your employees. So making sure they remember who you are as a company and what your team stands for. From the simple things like sending out postcards to them. To I've seen companies lately who've produced T-shirts with their company's logos on it and getting it out there to their team, not their customers, not their donors, to their team to remind them who they are. This is who we are and what we do. Okay, so we want to connect there because relatedness is important to keep your team together, make them feel like they are still part of a team right now, even though they could be working virtually or under duress in different ways. The last one is fairness, and fairness is vitally important at all times. That if anybody feels like that something is unfair, it's a very disengaging kind of process. So whatever the leader's thinking about doing, policy-wise, decision-wise, it may be a really good idea to vet that with your leadership team or vet that with your board to make sure that it seems fair. Because something that may sound good in the short term may end up causing real long-term damage to your company. So whatever has to happen should certainly be looked at as fair so that we can keep people engaged. So I just kind of went through the SCARF model really quickly. I'm sure there's other things out there. With more time, we would talk about it. But I promised Jody I'd only talk for 30 minutes, and I think I'm at my 30 minutes mark here. So
we do have a couple minutes here, Dino. You did a great job getting through that. We do have one question that was asked here that and I have a couple that came to me privately.
Sure.
How important is it to show vulnerability as a leader in the SCARF model?
Well, I think it's really important. It's a really good question. I mean, I think when we ask questions, and it's actually a form of showing vulnerability. When we ask questions, it's even if you might be afraid. I don't want to look stupid by asking this question, and people say, oh, it's not a dumb question. Well, no, there's no such thing as dumb questions. That if you're really asking questions about that you don't know the answer to, those are the best kind of questions. And it does feel like you're being vulnerable. You're saying, I really don't know what that would be. Let me ask. Those are fine. And sometimes we have to tell our teams that I right now I don't know the answer to that. And I heard an interesting phrase the other day. Someone said, that they reserve the right to be smarter later is a way that they're looking at it. I don't know that right now, but we're going to try to find this information out. I think that showing vulnerability, And then try to find that ability to be somewhere in between the middle of this, of the spectrum of I have some control and some things I don't have control over. Being aware of that self-regulating piece is, it's okay not to have all the answers right now. And it's okay to say, I don't have all the answers. And when I do, I'll let you know, but yeah, vulnerability is really important. It does help our teams. I think that servant leadership is based upon that idea of serving the team in a certain way. So being lower status to an extent is what that's about too. Very important.
Great. Lisa has a question. Lisa, I've unmuted you. Go ahead.
Hi, Dino.
Hey,
this notion of fairness, we're in a time right now where it is almost impossible to be fair with everybody. And let me give you an example. The first day we were closed, the library was closed, everybody was getting paid because our emergency policy said that if we had to close and it wasn't their fault, that they would get paid. Now we will be revisiting that, once we get to 8 weeks of this or 7 weeks of this. But we brought in all the managers and some key staff, and a few people needed to come in to work on things like payroll and things that day. It was the first day of this, and we already had somebody complaining, saying, well, it's not fair that I had to come in and other people are getting paid and they didn't have to come in.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to me, that seems so incredibly petty.
Mm-hmm.
But over time, I can understand people starting to feel like, hey, wait a minute, we are putting in 8-hour days, sometimes longer from home because our job lends itself to that. And here are other people who, maybe aren't putting in even an hour a week and they're getting paid too. And like I said, we're going to revisit that, but there are going to be situations that you just can't treat everybody exactly the same. There already are in real life without a crisis. In a crisis, if you stop to ask every decision you make, is it fair to everyone, you will be paralyzed. So how do you respond to that?
That's the challenge. I think the fairness one is probably the hardest one on the SCARF model to actually begin to practice. And it's probably the one that they're just simply beginning to scratch the surface on, because everyone's got different perspectives on what fairness would be. And so I think if you have situations where I've got individuals who are struggling, I'd probably want to have one-to-one conversations with them. But I'm talking about big decisions. If there's something like we're going to do a pay freeze, it needs to apply to everybody. If we're going to do any kind of cutback, we're going to be as fair as we can about that. But again, it could always strike somebody as this is unfair, especially when you get into the autonomy one. And so they get to have more time away, be at home, and I'm not. Sometimes that's just something that they need more information on. So it tends to come down to one-to-one. I think I would try to amp up the certainty part of the situation. Be sure you tell us as much information as you can, and being as honest as you can, and see if that counterbalances. And I don't know if you can get it 100% where everybody feels like that's I was being treated fairly, but you try the best you can.
Great. Thank you for that. So we are at our 30-minute mark. I warned Dino, I told him that we're really trying to hold these coffee chats to 30 minutes. We want to be respectful of all of your times, and 30 minutes goes so quickly. But we do really appreciate everybody being with us today. If you have some more questions, feel free to stay on. We'll hang out for a little while longer if you guys want to jump off. Next week, we are going to do the same format, Tuesday and Thursday. Tuesday, we're going to do this as a town hall. So everybody will be unmuted, and you guys can bring to us your things that are happening. We want to just go around the room and spread some joy. What things are going well for you as you are working from home or staying in place? What are the positive things that you're seeing in your workplace that you guys would like to share? But then also best practices that you might that you've learned just in this space. So that's going to be Tuesday. And then Thursday, we are going to have Jason Schenk join us as we talk about serving our vulnerable population during a crisis. And what does that look like for everybody? So that is next week. We hope to publish a full month of these for the rest of the month of April. We really appreciate you guys joining us. We hope that you are finding these topics useful. If you have ideas of what you would like to hear during the coffee chats, please give us some feedback either through the chat feature or send Ashley or me an email. We'd be happy to explore that option. Thank you, everybody, and I hope that you all have a blessed Easter season. Take care, everyone.